The Kitab-i-Gan, the Book of Certitude by Baha'u'llah, is stated by the guardian of the Baha'i Faith to be his most important doctrinal work and is second in status only to the Kitab-i-Aqdas in the writings of Baha'u'llah. I'm going to share with you not any authoritative pronouncements about the work, since no one can presume to have those except for the guardian and Abdul Baha. But I wanted to sort of take you on a tour of some of the things that I uncovered in the process of analyzing the structure of the work in the writing of my book, The Ocean of His Words. Like most Baha'is who have read the writings, I have focused a great deal of attention over the years to a study of the Kitab-i-Gan. And yet, each reading is always a new experience. Indeed, each reading seems to produce mysteriously a totally different work. There is an anecdote that I was told, I'm not sure how authoritative it is, but it's intriguing nonetheless, that the Baha'i scholar Mirza Abul Fazl had written in the cover of his copy of the Igan, the copy which was discovered after his death. I'm reading for the 23rd or 29th, I forget how many times, and there's still so much to learn. So when I was working on a structural analysis of the work, I didn't expect to discover a great deal that I didn't already know from having read it before, and yet I was amazed to discover an abundance of new information, or at least new to me. And that's what I want to share with you. It's interesting to me as a teacher of medieval literature that the Middle English word for the glossing of Scripture, or an interpretation of Scripture, is a pun on the word glosing, which means to lie or deceive, which ties in well with the beginning of the Igan, where Baha'u'llah says that the most important impediment to the understanding of Scripture through the ages has been the interpretation of Scripture on the part of the divines, the learned ones, the scholars of religion, simply because they, number one, by being scholars, tend to be rigorous, literal, oriented individuals, scientifically oriented, if you will, perhaps. I don't know what appellation would be accurate and yet not be too unkind. But the point is, he says, that the men of religion in every age have been the source of the defiance of, rejection of the prophets, and indeed the impediment to other people recognizing the advent of the prophets as well. But let me begin with, if you will, another anecdote that may help you understand why I thought a structural analysis important or appropriate. Many years ago, when I was invited to lead a deepening on this work, I was brand new to a community, and they had been studying the work for over a year. I didn't know this at the time, and I was asked to do a section, I think began about page 50. And so I proceeded, having just earned my PhD in literature, to analyze the structure of the rest of the work. And so everyone sat down in a circle and they pulled out their books, and I proceeded to show section for section what Baha'u'llah was attempting, as I understood it. And I saw these blank looks, or worse than blank, these antipathetic looks. And I realized I had done something horribly wrong, and I was informed politely by someone afterwards that they were accustomed to reading one sentence and discussing it for an hour. Well, regardless of what methods or tools one uses for study, and I'm sure there are many valid tools, I had seen, prior to that point, an outline that Horace Holly had done, not in very detailed or systematic, but just as a help to readers, a subject, really a subject categorization of the work. And so when I was writing this work on the tools of literary criticism as they can be used as a resource in studying the work of Baha'u'llah, I decided to do something that I had done in part before, and I wasn't going to do the whole work. I decided I would outline a few sections to show that it could be done. But the more I did, the more that I found that what I was professing to be true, namely that a structural analysis was helpful, really was helpful. And so what I did was to do the whole thing, because I couldn't stop. There was no good stopping point, because the thing is a continuum. It is a treatise, as the Guardian has called it, an apologia, which means a defense of a set of ideas in the realm of apologetical or apologetics. Of course, it's much more than that, and I'll discuss that in a minute, some of the things that it is. But what happened as I did this structural analysis, this outline, was to realize more of the kinds of continuity that is in the work, that are in the work. And I also discovered that the work is not only a defense or an apologia for the Babi faith, as the Guardian says, but it's also a proof of Christ to the Christians, of Muhammad to the Christians, of Muhammad to the Muslims, which surprised me, and of the Bab to the Muslims, and finally, in the end, a proof of Baha'u'llah to the people of the Bayan, the Babis, which I had never noticed before. Well, let me sort of, if I can, for this this talk, give you a sort of tour of some of the things I encountered. The outline, if you have a chance to look at my book, is over 60 pages long, so I can hardly, in the course of a few minutes, encapsulate everything I discovered or everything that I think is valuable. I have always been intrigued by the fact that Baha'u'llah in the work itself refers to the Kitabi-Gan as an argument. Now, of course, he means an argument not in the sense of a contention, but as a formal, logical defense or affirmation of something. And you can, of course, sort of divide the kinds of things that he's discussing up into fairly easily discernible parts. He is discussing why people have rejected the prophets. He's discussing the fact that the main reason for that is the poetic or imagistic nature of prophetic language. He's discussing the nature of the prophets themselves, what attributes they have, what common qualities they have. And he's also discussing specific prophecies and so on. That's not hard to see. But nevertheless, the stated purpose of the book, according to the title itself, is to enable the individual to enter the city of certitude. Now, certitude or conviction, as I understand it, is essentially an emotional state. You feel sure. You are convinced of something. You have confirmation of something. You are comfortable with your beliefs. And yet, at least in the West, particularly in Western Protestantism where I grew up, you induce conviction with emotion. That is, emotion begets emotion. So if you want to feel confirmed in your faith, you go to a revival. You have someone teach or preach in a highly pitched emotional voice, trying to urge you to feel penitent or guilty or happy, whatever. But you use emotion to appeal to emotion. And yet Baha'u'llah does exactly the opposite here, and that is, he presumes, we must infer from reading the work, that the best thing to attain this emotional state of conviction is a finely tuned argument or treatise, which is calculated to convince you of the Baha'i tenets of theodicy. Now, what is theodicy? Theodicy is the attempt to study theological concepts that will lead you to believe that it is possible to simultaneously hold that God is just and loving, and yet he also created this world which seems unjust and unloving. In effect, as Milton stated in the prologue to his work, Paradise Lost, to justify God's ways to man. How can we simultaneously believe in a good or just God and live in a world which was supposedly made by this just God, which seems patently unjust? In one sense, that's what this book is about. Now, that's kind of an indirect benefit from it. The most important benefit is that it is the explicit statement of most of Baha'i doctrine regarding the nature of prophets, when they come, how they come, and more importantly, how can you satisfy yourself that you have discovered one of them? And the converse of that, how do we explain that they have been missed? Or to put it in another way, if God is a divine educator, and his purpose is for us to recognize these individuals, then why haven't we done it? Why have we consistently not only not recognized them, but have persecuted and killed them? One must deduce from that that either we aren't sufficiently wise ever to get the point, or that God's not a very good educator, and neither one of which is a very felicitous conclusion. Well, let's begin by reading, if I can, the Guardian's statement from God Passes By of what he says the work does. Now, he's not presuming that this statement is the order in which it's done. And I know most of you have read this before, but let me read it to you again. This is from God Passes By, page 139. Let me see if I can put this where you can read it. Within a compass of 200 pages, the Kitabi-Gan proclaims unequivocally the existence and oneness of a personal God, unknowable, inaccessible, the source of all revelation, eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, and almighty, asserts the relativity of religious truth and the continuity of divine revelation, affirms the unity of the prophets, the universality of their message, the identity of their fundamental teachings, the sanctity of their scriptures, and the twofold character of their stations, denounces the blindness and perversity of the divines and doctors of every age, cites and elucidates the allegorical passages of the New Testament, the abstruse verses of the Quran, and the cryptic Mohammedan traditions which have bred those age-long misunderstandings, doubts and animosities that have sundered and kept apart the followers of the world's leading religious systems. enumerates the essential prerequisites for the attainment by every true seeker of the object of his quest, demonstrates the validity, the sublimity, and significance of the Bab's revelation, acclaims the heroism and detachment of his disciples, foreshadows and prophesies the worldwide triumph of the revelation promised to the people of the Bayan, upholds the purity and innocence of the Virgin Mary, glorifies the Imams of the faith of Muhammad, celebrates the martyrdom and lauds the spiritual sovereignty of the Imam Hussein, unfolds the meaning of such symbolic terms as return, resurrection, seal of the prophets, and day of judgment, adumbrates and distinguishes between the three stages of divine revelation, and expiates in glowing terms the glories and wonders of the city of God, renewed at fixed intervals by the dispensation of providence for the guidance and salvation of mankind. Well, that's a very elaborate and ostensibly exacting list, if you will, of what happens in the work, what Baha'u'llah does. But it doesn't show you how these things are related to one another. In other words, the Guardian isn't implying there what the structure is of how Baha'u'llah accomplishes these things. So in one sense, you can say that he has listed the goals and accomplishments of the work, but he hasn't told you how it does. He's almost saying, this is what you will discover if you read the work. Of course, the work was, as you all know, a response on the part of Baha'u'llah, as most of his works were responses to questions. This work was instigated by questions sent to Baha'u'llah by the as yet unconverted uncle of the Bab. And in Balyusi's Baha'u'llah, the King of Glory, he lists the summary of those questions. And this is on page 249 of my book, Ocean of His Words, and it's on page 164 of Baha'u'llah, the King of Glory. And Balyusi states that the gist of the questions presented to Baha'u'llah are as follows. And let me put this on the projector so perhaps you can read them along with me. Baha'u'llah, in the course of the Igan, discusses the day of resurrection. Is there to be, excuse me, this isn't what he's discussing. These are the questions that were put to him, which he, of course, then proceeds to answer, though not according, he doesn't use this as a structural basis for how he responds. But the answers to these questions are somewhere in the course of his discussion. Number one, the day of resurrection. Is there to be corporeal resurrection? The world is replete with injustice. How are the just to be requited and the unjust punished? 2, the 12th Imam was born at a certain time and lives on. There are traditions all supporting the belief. How can this be explained? Number 3, the interpretation of holy text. This cause does not seem to conform with the beliefs held throughout the years. One cannot ignore the literal meaning of holy text and scripture. How can this be explained? 4, certain events according to the traditions that have come down from the Imams must occur at the advent of the Qaim. Some of these are mentioned, but none of these has happened. How can this be explained? Now, the list that the Guardian gives us in God Passes By, coupled with these questions that were posed by the uncle of the Bab, give us insight into what instigated the writing of the Igan. Of course, we can presume that Baha'u'llah would have written it anyway, even if he had not been asked. But neither the list of the guardian nor this list of the 4 categories of questions that were asked gives us clue to how Baha'u'llah then proceeds to structure his answer, if you will. In my work, The Ocean of His Words, I propose as just sort of a useful but hardly authoritative or inevitable approach to structural analysis, a sort of 3-part process. The first part is to look at a work with regard to the most obvious sorts of grouping of ideas. In other words, as you read through the work, what units of thought do you discover? The second part of the process I propose is to then proceed to take those groups and make a literal outline. This is particularly doable these days with outlining engines that most word processors have, because when you mess up, everything falls back into place if you take one group out or recategorize it, elevate it to a major category, and so on. The third part of the process I suggest is to then look at the outline and discover, if you can, what unifying theme or themes have been produced by this outline. In effect, to see what your outline has taught you. Let me begin then by first touching on a couple of things that I noticed right away that I hadn't noticed before. And then I'll go to those 3 parts: the grouping, the outline, and the things I discovered. One of the first things I noticed as I looked through it, and again, you usually read the writings because you need to read the writings, because there's something you want to find out. When you read in a sort of critically analytical way, you're sort of detached from it, and you're looking at the work as opposed to something you need. Not that you can always make a clear distinction between those 2 processes, but I think you can see what I'm talking about. The first thing I noticed that I had never noticed before, though I'm sure most people have, is that after the initial listing of the prophets and the iniquity with which they were received on the part of the followers of the previous prophet, the sort of same thing that is done in the Surah of Hud in the Quran, Baha'u'llah on page 22 introduces an example of the kinds of verses that have tripped up the followers of religion. And that is, he has said the main consistent thread of failure or cause of failure among the followers of the previous manifestation is their inability to understand language. And in one sense, this book is a book about language. The whole first half of it is a beautiful treatment of how to understand poetry. And so he says, let me show you an example of how this has occurred. And on page 22, he states the following: this wronged one will cite but one of these instances, thus conferring upon mankind for the sake of God such bounties as are yet concealed within the treasury of the hidden and sacred tree, that happily mortal man may not remain deprived of their share of the immortal fruit and attain to a dewdrop of the waters of everlasting life. He goes on, but the word dewdrop is the one word I focus on in that passage on page 22, because this dewdrop, as he calls it, which implies there's a vast ocean awaiting you, but here's a little dewdrop, here's a little sample of what can be done, of what information can be imparted. That dewdrop lasts from page 22 through page 116. So in other words, the first 100 pages is an explication of a verse which he cites on page 24, namely the verse from Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. This one passage in which Christ discusses the conditions for the second coming, Baha'u'llah explicates for a full 100 pages. So in other words, in one sense, the structure for those 100 pages is as clear as it can be. Each successive part of that, as we'll see in a minute, forms the basis for his discussion in those 116 pages. I knew what was happening in those 116 pages before I did the outline, but I didn't happen to notice that they all relate back to page 24. Well, these are the kinds of things I discovered. Another thing I discovered right away that interested me was the fact that I always presumed that Baha'u'llah was, as this is a defense of the Station of the Bab, proving to the Muslims that Baha'u'llah was the Qaim. And yet, curiously, most of these 100 pages don't say anything about the Qaim. They're talking, he's explicating and interpreting Christian scripture. Now, why is he interpreting Christian scripture to prove the Station of the Bab? And you realize he's not. What he's doing is showing the Muslims that Christian scripture accurately predicts the coming of Muhammad. And therefore, what he's doing, in effect, is saying, before I can teach you how your scripture foretells the coming of the Bab, let me show you how you should have vindicated your own prophet in Christian scripture. Because, as he says, what you claim is that Christian scripture doesn't accurately foretell the coming of Muhammad because the texts have been corrupted. He says that's not what is meant by the corruption of the text. What, did someone go take every Bible that had ever been written and change something in it? He says that's absurd. He says what is meant by the term corruption of the text is the misinterpretation of Scripture, or to put it in the simplest terms, taking literally that which is meant to be understood in a figurative or poetic way. And so what I realized was, because it's very explicitly stated by Baha'u'llah in the work, is that this whole first part is teaching the Muslims how they can vindicate the station of Muhammad by using Christian scripture, showing the texts aren't corrupted, you just don't know how to read it. And if you don't know how to read Christian scripture, you're going to do the same thing with the Quran. Take it literally, and therefore, instead of understanding the spiritual or poetic meaning, you're going to do the same thing to the Bab that was done to Muhammad. And indeed, of course, that's exactly what did happen. One other thing I'll mention, I'll reiterate this later, but it's another, if you will, one of the choice surprises that awaited me. And again, this is after having read the book many times before, was I did not realize how explicitly the work is just as much aimed at the people of the Bayan, the Babis, as it is at the Muslims. And that is, of course, the work is written before his pronouncement to the Babis that he was him whom God will make manifest. And so supposedly he is in this work, even though it's a major work in his own revelation, as the Guardian says, this is an apologia or a defense of the Babi faith. And yet very clearly at the end he says, and the same thing the Christians did, and the same thing the Muslims are doing, is the same thing you're going to do if you aren't careful. And he then goes on to say, and you're doing it right now. Because what he does, and I'll show you where that is later, is very clearly identify himself as the one that the Bab had foretold. He makes very clear reference to that. So while the focus, in one sense, and he says this as well, and this was, I guess, summarizes the heart of what the argument is about. He says this treatise, this argument, as he repeatedly refers to this work, is adequate not only to prove the validity of the station of the Bab, but also the validity of any prophet in any dispensation. And that too was something that I had not realized before in reading the work, and that is, he gives an explicit process of proof. And I'll discuss in a minute what that process is. Well, let me begin with the first part of the process, the grouping of ideas. Again, any one of these can be done many different ways. I certainly hope that you understand. I am not stating that my outline is the outline. There are many things I would waffle on insofar as making my own outline. And on the one hand, I spent all day, every day for 2 months doing it, and yet I felt like I was hardly scratching the surface, and I could see immediately after I'd done it many other ways of doing it. So the same thing true with the initial step of what are the major groups of ideas. Well, there are many ways. There's lots of overlapping because it is a skillfully interwoven work. I'll write these on the board so that you can follow me better. The work begins, of course, first off with after the statement of theme, which is, why have the prophets been rejected? And he states, because of the divines have misunderstood divine utterance. And so he begins with a sort of chronological list of the prophets, and I won't list the prophets. You can certainly turn in the book to that. Notice, number one, it's not all the prophets by any means, though there's some that we don't know much about, such as Saleh and Hud and so on, who are mentioned in the Quran, and several others. But he lists these, again, not as a complete list and not to give their life history, but for one purpose, to show how each one of them went through the same process of being rejected by the very people to whom they had explicitly come and who had been explicitly warned by their own prophet that this would occur. And so he talks about how Noah was rejected, how Abraham was rejected, and so on. This goes on through approximately page 17. And he begins the vindication of Christ. And I separate this from the list because Christ is where he sort of pauses and shows for the next 100 pages how Christ prophesies Muhammad. And so pages 17 through about 22 or so, he vindicates Christ to the Jews, showing how Christ was the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy and why Christ was not understood in this context. And next, then, for the next 100 pages or we'll say page 24 through 116. Again, this is not pretending to be exact. He explicates the passage from Matthew about the coming of Muhammad. Now, first of all, let's look at the passage itself. Let me see if I can get this on the overhead where you can read it. Immediately after the oppression of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from the heaven, and the powers of the earth shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of trumpet. That's again Matthew 24. Here, I'll write that up here. That's Matthew 24, 29 through 31. Now, the structure, and again, he will often digress. In other words, it's on the one hand, you can outline this, and it is a treatise, but it's by no means dry. There's humor, there's anecdotes, there's digressions, which he calls digressions. He says, let me digress, and he will go into some digressive point. But basically, if I put down here for you the list of the major portions of that verse, you can see and recall from your own reading how he discusses the allegorical or symbolic or metaphorical. They're all more or less designating the same analogical process, where he in effect explicates the meaning of each of these parts of that verse. What does the word oppression mean, on number one? Number two, what does it mean by the sun being darkened? What does it mean by the moon does not give light, the stars falling from heaven, and so on? And you will recall from your own reading that, of course, in each case there is a symbolic meaning that he explains, and he even shows you in different scriptures from other sources the same usage, so that in effect this whole first 100 pages becomes somewhat of a primer, if you will, for anyone who reads it on how to read Scripture. So in other words, the first 20 pages is saying, here's the problem. Of course, he states it earlier than that. He states it the first and second page of the work. Here's the problem. People have rejected the prophets. Why? Because they understood Scripture or divine utterance in literal terms. So he then says, how can I help you understand how not to do that? So he says, let me give you a dewdrop, an example from the ocean of Scripture to show you how it works. And so basically pages 24 through 116, really goes beyond that, is a textbook, if you will, of instruction by Baha'u'llah on how to read Scripture. Now, it's not, in other words, it's important the particular Scripture he chose. He's not just sort of randomly saying, well, let me take any passage and show you how it can be done, though he certainly could have done that. Of course, this particular Scripture ties in directly to the process of how Christ forewarned his followers that another prophet would come. And here's the one passage where he does that. Here's how you could have done it. Now, again, the curious thing about this And this is maybe one of the most profound things that my exercise helped me discover about the process of attaining certitude that Baha'u'llah is advocating. Going back to what I've already said, he is proving the station of Muhammad not to Christians. I mean, he's doing that too. But he is, after all, talking primarily to an unconverted Muslim, that is, unconverted to the Babi faith. He's talking to a Muslim. And indeed, the primary audience, he must presume, or the most immediate audience for his work, is a Muslim audience, or at least an audience coming out of a Muslim context. Why is he bothering, since they have already accepted Muhammad, to show them the process by which Muhammad can be demonstrated or can be vindicated? Well, as I've already said, what I discovered is he is demonstrating that they are in the same danger of rejecting the next prophet as the Sanhedrin was in their literal interpretation of Old Testament scripture, which led them to reject Christ. So in effect, he's telling them, you are doing right now, by rejecting the Bab, the exact same thing that the Sanhedrin did to Christ. You are literally understanding your own prophecies, or you're taking your prophecies literally, and therefore you don't understand what they really mean. Another related point that was just incredibly intriguing to me was this. As you no doubt have noticed as you read the Iqan, it is replete with allusions to references from the Quran. Very explicit passages. Now, that would seem certainly appropriate, since he's teaching primarily a Muslim audience. What I came to realize as I outlined the work was something I had never understood before. Was I had always presumed he was citing passages from the Quran in order to prove the validity of what he was saying. In other words, as if to say, I'm saying this and so, and here you can see, as you had already understood in the Quran, is the exact same idea. And when I realized it's exactly the reverse. He's taking passages from the Quran that the Muslims, or at least the Muslim ulama, the teachers, the divines, and the clerics, had totally misunderstood, either by misinterpreting or just not understanding, but usually by misapplying and misunderstanding. Certainly the passage, the seal of the prophets, is the most weighty misinterpretation, which he spends a great deal of time on, of course. And so a fourth thing, if you will, let me use the purple marker since it's working, is, and it's not really a group so much, but it really becomes one, and that is, I'm going to give you an example on pages, and there are many of them, they're throughout, but I'm going to give you one particular one to show you what I'm talking about. Pages 138, 139. Baha'u'llah alludes to, well, I'm trying to see how much to set this. It's an intriguing it's somewhat of a digression. He is referring to the utter destitution into which this people have fallen doth surely suffice them, inasmuch as they have been deprived of the recognition of the essential purpose and the knowledge of the mystery and substance of the cause of God. This is on page 138. He says, in effect, they have been given all the guidance they need, and yet they misconstrued its meaning. Now, let me put this in front of you so you can see what I'm talking about here, if you can read through all my markings. How numerous are those revealed verses which explicitly bear witness unto this most weighty truth and exalted theme, and yet they have rejected it, and after their own desire misconstrued its meaning, even as he hath revealed. And here he is again quoting from, the he is Muhammad. He's quoting from the Quran. As you can see down at the bottom here, it's the Quran, Surah 29, verse 23. As for those who believe not in the signs of God, or they that shall ever meet him, these of my mercy shall despair, and for them doth a grievous chastisement await. Also he hath said, they who bear in mind that they shall attain unto the presence of their Lord, and that unto him they shall they return. Also in another instance he saith, they who held it as certain that they must meet God say, how oft by God's will hath a small host vanquished a numerous host. Now, what he's in the middle of doing here is explicating this passage down here about what is the meaning of attaining unto the divine presence. Because the divines that interpret this literally, in other words, that you would be literally in the presence of God, and he is explaining that what is meant by that is that the manifestation, the prophet among you in your midst is the presence of God. And that's what you are trying to attain. Now, to get back to my point, what is intriguing then is that throughout, and I don't mean it's confined to these pages, but this is just one example of many, many, many. One of the other, and so this really isn't a group so much. I probably should not put that up there, but it's something that I think is very important, and that is, he is not using the Quran to explain what he's saying. He's using what he's saying to explain these abstruse passages in the Quran. So it's the other way around. And of course, the concept again comes to mind of the unsealing of the books, which I always, again, from my Christian background, presumed was unsealing, you know, as in the New Testament, unsealing the books insofar as making everything clear. But he really is taking the divine utterance of Muhammad and making it clear for the first time. For the first time, the Muslims really could understand what is really meant by these passages. So that was another thing that I had never really understood before, and that is that the passages in the Quran that he cites in order to explain them, not to vindicate him. Though, of course, it has that effect as well. Another part that I observed as I would read through it is the discussion of the nature of the prophets. And of course, we can go to the writings of Abdu'l-Baha in some answered questions and get very explicit statements about the station of the prophets, that they are essentially distinct from the beginning, that they are infallible, and so on. But the first and foremost place where this is discussed is in the Igan, where Baha'u'llah talks about, as the Guardian says in that list, the two essential stations of the prophet. And these are pages 152 through 176, where he discusses the station of essential unity of the prophets, namely that all the prophets come for the same purpose. They all are aware of each other. that they all, in effect, are minions or viceroys of the same divine source. And then he talks about a subject that is very dear to me, and that is the station of distinction, which in one sense is presented as the human aspect of the prophet. And yet, as Abdu'l-Baha makes clear in some answered questions, these are not essentially ordinary human beings. And so what is made clear in this, if one reads it carefully, is that by distinction he doesn't mean that they are just, on the one hand, ordinary human beings, but that they are distinct insofar as the time and context in which they appear. So the distinction is not so much, if you will, that they're really different from one another and they really have a different approach, or that they are shaped by history. And this is what's so often misunderstood, is that he's not implying they are products of the age in which they appear and therefore are distinct from one another. He is saying that they consciously adapt their persona to fit the age in which they must appear. Okay? So they are distinct from one another because the exigencies of the process, the teaching process they must use, forces them to apply distinct methods. And so I don't need to say anything more, but I think that's clear. Another group, if you will, of discernible group of ideas in the work is what I'm calling the proofs of the prophets. And that would be approximately, and again, this is not exact. If you want to see the whole thing, look at the outline itself. 181 through almost to the end, 181 through 248, the proofs of the prophets. And I will deal with that more in just a minute, because that really is the focus of what I wanted to end on here, is this part here, because this is so important. Since the work is an argument, it is a proof, this is the heart of the proof itself. Everything else sort of leads up to this result. In other words, this more or less states the problem. This is the solution. And then finally, I don't know if you can call it a section, it's only about 3 pages long, pages 248 through 252. I don't know how to put this, but I'll just put proof of himself. And that is, Baha'u'llah, at the very end of the Igan, that should be a 5, at the very end of the Igan, well, here, let me back up. The proofs of the prophets, excuse me, is a 4-part process. I'm not imposing that. That is, he says there are 4 parts to this proof. Here they are, and here's how they work, and that's what I want to close with. But finally, he ends up with a proof of himself, and that is, he alludes very clearly to the fact that he is the promised one of the Bab. He makes explicit allusions to that. And in effect, and it's a real dramatic, you've got to understand how dramatic this conclusion is. He's saying, in effect, you who have already recognized the Bab are about to be subjected to the exact same test as have all these people. And of course, It's only a year later that the tablet of the Holy Mariner is revealed, approximately a year later, a little more. The tablet of the Holy Mariner is revealed, in which Baha'u'llah foretells the calamity that will occur when he reaches Adrianople, and in effect these Babis will turn against him. Well, let us get to the concluding part of my discovery, my journey of discovery, if I will. And again, if you really want to know the fullness of that journey, such as it is, do look at the outline. It was tremendous, I hate to say lots of fun to do, but it really was. I don't know other word to use. It was just a joy to do this, which is why I didn't stop. As I say, I was going to just give a sample outline and then stop. But as I did it, I couldn't reach a point where I wanted to stop. There are 4 proofs, and I will give you the pages on which these proofs occur. Page 181 through 221 is the first proof, and it is the most important. And these, he does, as I understand it, Baha'u'llah seems clearly to imply that these are in a descending hierarchical order. That the foremost proof is divine utterance itself. And in one sense, then, all of this, well, not all of this, say up to about here, is demonstrating this right here. Here's how utterance works. Here's how that proof becomes a proof, if you understand how to read Scripture. And so 181 through 221, Baha'u'llah says the foremost proof of the identity of the prophet is not his physical person, is not the fulfillment of prophecy, is not any miracles associated with the manifestation, but is his word. All right? And so if you are going to recognize the prophet or confirm your belief in the prophet, it's not enough simply to be filled with spirit. That may do for a while, but at some point your conviction, your certitude, must rely on your awareness of and understanding of the divine utterance. Secondly, pages 221 through 230, Baha'u'llah describes as the constancy of the early followers, those who arise to proclaim and to give their lives in the path of the cause. And he says on page 220, therefore should a person arise and bring forth a myriad verses, discourses, epistles, and prayers, none of which have been acquired through learning, what conceivable excuse could justify those reject him? That's the end of the first proof. The second proof then, he begins on 221, states the following. Amongst the proofs demonstrating the truth of this revelation is that in every age and dispensation, whenever the invisible essence was revealed in the person of his manifestation, certain souls, obscure and detached from all worldly entanglements, would seek illumination from the sun of prophethood and moon of divine guidance, and would attain unto the divine presence. And he then goes on 2 pages later to list many of those who had given their lives and their all in recognition of the Bab. So I'll just put in abbreviated fashion, certain souls arise. This would be the individuals who, with no ulterior motive, altruistically demonstrate their love of the prophet by either giving their lives or devoting their lives to service. The third proof, this would be pages 230 through 248, 230 through 237, is what Baha'u'llah calls the constancy of the prophet. And here again, in one sense, it's the same qualities of this, but in other words, the question is, since none of the manifestations request or seek or obtain, in fact, actively reject worldly ascendancy, either worldly goods or worldly office, they repeatedly note this. Neither goods nor position, and yet they remain constancy in the face of the fact they're being rejected by the very people they come to assist, that they could at any time, and this is made abundantly clear, extricate themselves from these situations, and yet in every case they remain constant. So the constancy of the prophet is a proof of who he is. And the fourth proof Baha'u'llah gives, even though he interestingly says, I really don't want to do this one, but I will do it just for you, because I know you like this sort of stuff, but I really don't. This is on page 237. He says, we did not intend to make mention of the traditions of a bygone age, yet because of our love for thee, we will cite a few which are applicable to our argument. We do not feel their necessity, however, inasmuch as we have already mentioned what we have already mentioned, as the things we have already mentioned suffice the world and all that is therein. And so what he then proceeds to do during the course of these pages is to cite the hadith from as authentic a sources as could be cited, collection of supposedly authentic sayings of either Muhammad or Ali or the other imams. And he passages which allude to the coming of the Qaim, and he explicates them. Now you can divide this up differently or see in the course of these discussions other proofs and so on. Again, I don't propose this as authentic. I said he says that there are four. I'm not sure I'm correct on that. It's been a while since I did this, and I don't remember if he says there are four. But he does categorize them, saying here's another kind of proof and here's another. And he does imply that these are in a descending order, that this is the foremost. So the hadith. Then finally, the proof of himself. And I'd like to close with this because, as I say, this was another surprise for me. The work is a proof of the Bab. It's really a proof of prophecy itself. It is certitude not only about Baha'u'llah, but it is certitude about the process of prophecy. On page 248, he states in the beginning of this passage to the Babis, we entreat the learned men of the Bayan not to follow in such ways, not to inflict at the time of Mustachath, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that, the anointed one, upon him who is the divine essence, the heavenly light, the absolute eternity. the beginning and the end of manifestations of the invisible, that which has been inflicted in this day. We beg them not to depend upon their intellect, their comprehension and learning, nor to contend with the revealer of celestial and infinite knowledge. And yet, and here let me put this in front of you, and yet, notwithstanding all these admonitions, we perceive that a one-eyed man, and this is alluding to Syed Muhammad of Isfahan, who himself is the chief of the people, is arising with the utmost malevolence against us. Against us. And he goes on to even allude in these passages to his sojourn to Suleymaniye and how that was brought about and so on. Well, needless to say, I could go on quite a long time. You don't really ever reach any final statements about the Igan or what it's doing. But I hope, if nothing else, I have shared with you what a joy it was for me to do this exercise. I don't necessarily exhort you to do the same thing, and yet it is a thoroughly useful kind of critical approach to the work to help you see the threads of unity woven throughout the work as the structure is clearly integral to the work. Not all of the works of Baha'u'llah are structured in a linear fashion. And this is not always explicitly linear. There are paths and digressions in it. But it is fundamentally linear because an argument requires a linear process. And yet works such as the Agdas, very difficult to find any sort of linear development there. A different kind of structure and structural analysis would be required for that. So I've enjoyed presenting this, and I hope it has had some value for you. Thank you very much.